Hello and welcome to FTD Talk. My name is John James and I am writer and campaigner for male victims of female perpetrated domestic violence. In this week's episode, we talk to Mike about a recovery program that he's put together for male victims of abuse and his own abuse. This is Mike's story.
Okay, welcome Michael to FTD Talk. And before we talk about the program that you're involved in, I'd like to ask you a bit about your history. Could you tell me about your experience in being a victim of domestic violence, please?
Yeah, sure. I left a relationship in December of 2015, which was very violent and abusive in a number of different ways. And what I realized or found out afterwards, after doing some counseling and other programs, is that I had actually been in abusive relationships, a number of them my whole adult life. I just seemed to go from one romantic relationship to another. And they all feature different levels of abuse. The most recent one was the most abusive, though. So I was escalating. I was finding partners that were ever more escalating in their violence. But let me just tell you about some of the things that occurred in that relationship. There's a whole range of things, but in terms of the physical violence, let's start with that. At the beginning of the relationship, and it was a 5-year-long relationship, the physical violence started about 2.5-ish years into it. And it started very almost innocuously. We were sitting across a table from each other, and she was doing some work, and she had what we in North America call Post-it notes. I don't know if you call that over on your side of the pond, but just a small Post-it note, and she wrinkled it up, scrunched it up, and threw it at me, and it hit me in the face. Obviously, no damage from that or anything like that. But what I came to realize later on is that was just her pushing my boundaries to see if I would accept that level of abuse, which I clearly did. I didn't strongly object or say, don't ever do that again or anything. And then that escalated into throwing other things like pens and pencils and erasers. And then that escalated into throwing, dishes and utensils, and ultimately a frying pan got thrown at me one time, and as I was leaving a room, a bowl was thrown at me that hit the door frame beside me, and I got nicked by the shrapnel from that. So that was where the physical started, and then it progressed into she would grab me by the chest hair, quite literally, and yank on it and pull out my chest hair. And then that progressed into she would begin to punch me, and she always punched in places where there wouldn't be any obvious bruises. I don't bruise easily anyway, but she would punch me in the thighs when I was laying down, or on the shoulders if I was standing up. And then that progressed to the most egregious, I guess, and the one that scared me the most is that she came at me one time with a 10-inch chopping knife, a kitchen knife, in a blind rage, and she came in my direction. Luckily, we were 6 or 8 feet apart, and I was able to exit the house and get out of there. And by the time I came back to the house, things had calmed down. And then subsequent to that was only about a month before I left the relationship. And that was sort of, for me, the pivot point where I said, okay, that's it, I've got to get out of here. But I still hadn't really made any plans for getting out until about 2 weeks after the knife incident or so. We were by this time in separate rooms. And it was an old Victorian style house with original hardware on the doors. And so the doors in the rooms didn't lock. So I kind of had my door, jammed shut with a door stop underneath it, because she had been making some sort of threats, I guess, if you will. They were kind of covert-y type threats about things she might do to me in my sleep. But then about 2 weeks after the knife incident, I woke up in the middle of the night with her outside my door, just screaming, like blood-curdlingly loud screams, saying, I'm going to kill him. I have to kill him. That's the only way. It's the only thing I can do is I have to kill him. And that happened twice within about 3 or 4 days, which was the final straw for me that I eventually, said, okay, now I have to leave. So that was the physical part, but there was all kinds of other ones. She isolated me socially from my friends. So we had lived about a half hour apart before we moved in together to cohabitate, and once we moved in, I started wanting to have some relations with and get her together with some of my friends and their partners. And what would happen is every time we would get together with one of my friends and their partners, my ex afterwards would say, oh, I can never get together again with them because of my partner's ex. She never liked any of my partner's exes. So that was a way of her to begin to isolate me away from my friends, because then it became harder for us to get together as a couple. And so, but at the same time, I was also beginning to not feel very good about myself, and that has to do with the psychological abuse that I was suffering. She was very denigrating to me and gaslighting in the way that she would tell me that I wasn't very smart or I wasn't very bright. And I had been in my own business for a number of years when I met her, but at the time I was transitioning. So I'm a management consultant, and I've been working with large organizations more recently, and I wanted to go back to working with small organizations, which I'd done in the past. So I'd begin to let contracts expire that I had. Most of my contracts were for 6 months or a year type periods, and I had maybe a dozen of them when we first met, and I started letting some of them expire with the plan of developing a new marketing plan and getting new clients in a different market. And so I was letting them expire, and at the same time concurrently building a marketing plan and so on. And so two things sort of happened at the same time. As I was letting contracts expire and I was working on my marketing plan, it wasn't coming together as quickly as I would like. And so at one point in time, one of the contracts that expired, and I renewed it. And I think for like 6 months, and she became unhinged at me for renewing that contract. And what was wrong with me? I didn't respect myself. I was I had no self-esteem, that I was taking on contracts to work for people who I didn't really want to be working with, and so on. And so on one hand, she was working on me to kind of restrict my income that way. And then on the other hand, when I did develop my marketing plan and was ready to begin to communicate with clients, part of the plan was to make phone calls to clients and then leave messages if they weren't there. And I had a script that I developed and paid money to work with a coach and to develop that script. And so I remember the very first time I was delivering that voicemail to somebody. Very first time, I'd put months into building this plan and building the script and so on. And it turns out that she happened to be home on that day. And I never really thought about that, but I delivered the voice message, and she came into my office like immediately thereafter and said, "Oh, nobody's ever going to buy from you if you leave voice messages like that. You just had so little confidence. You didn't even sound like someone who could even do the job." And just went on, putting me down. Now, clearly I have some complicity in this because I internalized that message, but it was gaslighting as well. But what it did to me is that it made it very, very hard for me to have confidence in going out and leaving voicemails again. And so it also became very hard for me to do it when she was in the house. And she worked part-time from home as well and part-time out in the field. And so she was home a lot. And so it just really made it really difficult for me to start making calls. So it really restricted my ability to work. On one hand, she was judging me very harshly for maintaining any of the contracts that I already had. And then on the other hand, she was denigrating me and putting me down for attempting to build new businesses, so that was a restriction of it. And I can't even figure out how or why I did this. When I think back to that time, I was so traumatized in that relationship that I can't remember all the details. But at some point in time, I had given her, we had commingled our assets, and I had sold my house to move in with her. And somehow I had given her control over all of our collective money. And she somehow with the bank, and I'm not even sure all the mechanisms of this, again, because I was very traumatized and very didn't have much of my resources left near the end of that relationship. I couldn't think, I couldn't focus, I couldn't concentrate. I was a mess. But she had somehow gotten with the banks so that she had control of all the money, and I didn't. And so then she started controlling how much money I could spend. And because I wasn't making much of my own money, because I had been getting rid of contracts and I wasn't selling new contracts, I ended up being dependent upon her in about the last year for my financial well-being, which of course that gives one person a lot of control over the other person when they have control of all the finances.
Well, she controlled every aspect of your life then.
Yeah, pretty much. And yeah, I mean, and so there was the psychological abuse where she was putting me down constantly.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the other part of the psychological abuse is that, and this is sort of psychological / social, is that whenever when we had to have a planned event, like we were going to, I don't know, a music concert or a show of some kind, which we purchased tickets for, it was very common, probably about 50% of the time, just before we would leave, somewhere between half an hour to an hour before we were ready to go out the door, she would pick a fight. And often it was over the most innocuous, silly, stupid things, but she would pick a fight. And then that would escalate into her not wanting to go out to whatever that thing was. So we spent so much money on tickets to things that we never went to. It was almost ridiculous how often that happened. Then it got to a point where I just didn't even want to say yes to making any of those kind of arrangements because I just didn't think we were ever going to do it. But that then also leads into the idea of that she used her rage a lot, and it got to the point where as things progressed in the relationship, she would get angry constantly about, I say constantly, but just very often, ridiculously often, about things of zero consequence whatsoever. And it seemed like she was trying to pick a fight with me. And I'm a very pacifistic type of person, and so I didn't really engage and get into it. When I get angry, my MO is to withdraw. And so I would just withdraw and then go either leave the house or go to my room or whatever. And then she would often come into my room and stand in the doorway and berate me and harangue me from the doorway. So yeah, like I want to give you an example. And this is kind of gaslighting and nonsensical conversations. And I guess the other thing I would say is she had a lot of rules, and the rules would change, but she would still, have rules and then be able to get upset at me for me breaking one of these rules. And so one of the rules, and this, I know this just sounds ridiculous on the surface, but it's I think a good illustration of the way that she was able to control me.
Yeah. One
of her rules was that when one person's already in a room, and we were living together in a house, there was only two of us in the house. So if one person was already in the room and the other person entered the room or came in from outside, it was one or the other person's responsibility to say hi, to initiate a conversation. And I still to this day do not know who it is, whether it's the person already in the room or the person entering the room, because the way it played out was I would come into the room. She was already there. I'd come into the room and I'd say, "Hey, how are you doing?" And she'd say, "Why, you are so rude. You're interrupting me. I was in the middle of doing something. Why don't you just wait until I say hi?" And so I'd say, "Okay," I'd make a mental note of that. All right, it's whoever's already in the room, that's their job. So the next time, a few days later, I'd enter the room and I wouldn't say anything. she'd say, "What's wrong with you? Why are you so rude? Why are you ignoring me? Why don't you even talk to me? That's just rude." And so then
Yes.
I'd like go, "Well, I thought it was," and she'd go, "No, no, no, it's this way." And so I remember actually writing it down on my phone one time afterward, because I was getting less and less able to think, really, quite frankly, and remember and organize my thoughts. So I remember writing it down in my phone, writing down, "It's the person entering the room," whatever it was. I don't remember exactly. It was one or the other. I wrote it down. It's the person entering the room. So the next time I was coming into the room, I looked at my phone and read what I wrote down. So I did whatever I wrote down. And she still told me I'd done the wrong thing. And I said, "Look, I wrote it down on my phone, what you told me last time." And she said, "You wrote it down wrong." So there was
Right.
there was no winning.
Yeah. So it doesn't matter what you do, you were always in the wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that went on and on and on. That was just one example. I could give you hundreds of those examples. And so so for me, I mean, I'll just tell you what my experience was, is that after a period of time, I got very shut down and I didn't want to do anything or talk to anybody. Um, I remember going to her sister's birthday party with her family, and there was like, I don't know, 15 people there, and we were all at one table. And I was sitting beside her sister, and my ex was sitting across the table from us. And at some point in time, I was just kibitzing and laughing with her sister, and whatever. We're having a good time, kind of joking. And I saw my partner, her face would change when she would get angry. Literally, she looked like a different person. And she'd get into this rage. And I could see it changing as I was talking to her sister. And then after we left in the car on the way home, she just like tore a strip off me, how I was being sexual with her sister. And everybody at the table saw what I was doing, and how could I be flirting and all that kind of stuff. And there was nothing sexual about it. It was just normal conversation that you would have with another person, male or female, wouldn't matter. But that was just the way that she rolled, you know?
Yeah, just another reason to have a go at you.
Yeah, and she came up with them all over the place. I'll give you another example. We were playing pool one evening, and we played pool, I don't know, once or twice a month or something like that. And when we were done, I realized that I hadn't brought my wallet in, that it was out in the car, and she hadn't brought hers in either. And so I agreed to put the cues and the balls and everything away if she would go out to the car and get her purse, so that we could pay for the pool. And so I put the balls away and the cues, etc., got everything cleaned up, and took them over to the front desk. And there was a sports thing, a hockey game on the TV behind the front desk. And so I was leaning on the bar there, I guess, looking at the hockey game. And she came back in, and I just saw again that rage on her face, and I often don't know what it is, but I saw that it happened. And so anyway, she paid, and we went back out in the car. And again, she just went at me because she said I had sent her out to the car so that I could watch hockey. And I mean, I'd been watching it for maybe 15 seconds before she walked in. I mean, just completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
But there was no way to have that argument with her. There was nothing. And so it got to a point where I don't know if this makes sense, but I just completely shut down, and I didn't want to do anything, because almost anything I did could end up in one of her rages at me.
Yeah. So you were walking on eggshells. You didn't know what to do.
Absolutely not. And as a matter of fact, what I ended up choosing to do was pretty much nothing. I basically just sat in a chair during the waking hours on my phone or computer, and that was about it. Because I didn't even I wouldn't even eat when she was there. I'd wait till she would leave the house to eat, because the food that I ate, the way I prepared the food, the way I ate the food, the way I cleaned up afterwards was all susceptible to her abusive disagreement in how I did it.
And did you ever discuss this with anybody? Did you ever discuss it with friends, or even report the violence to the police?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's an interesting aspect of this as well, for me anyway, interesting for me. So I did tell one friend who happened to be an MD, a medical doctor, and he was not practicing. He was a drug treatment doctor at the time, so he wasn't really practicing sort of family medicine sort of thing. But I did tell him, and the reaction that I got from him wasn't. It was basically just flat. He didn't say, oh, don't talk about that. But he also didn't. He wasn't empathetic whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so out of that, I kind of made a decision to not tell anybody because I didn't get a very fulfilling response from him. However, I did start seeing a counselor about maybe a year or maybe 8 months before the relationship ended. And I was able to disclose the things with that counselor, and she was very, very supportive. As a matter of fact, I realized afterwards that she was, in the way that counselors won't give you directives, but will try and guide you in a direction. She was trying to guide me to get myself out of that relationship. But she wasn't really, she wasn't saying, you got to leave to protect yourself. She was kind of trying to guide me and help me, but I didn't get it. I wasn't hearing it at the time. I realized afterwards that's what she was doing, but yeah.
And I asked this of virtually everybody I speak to, why didn't you leave?
Yeah, I'm just going to go back to the previous question, just have an addendum. So I also did. So what I started what started happening is I started having these pretty severe panic attacks where I literally thought I was going to die. I thought I was having a heart attack, and so I went to my doctor, my family doctor, who was also my ex's doctor. So we shared that doctor, and reported what was happening, and we did all kinds of tests. And in fact, some of the panic attacks were so to the extreme that I would dissociate for sometimes hours at a time, 4 to 6 hours. And so the doctor did all kinds of tests on my heart and full physicals, and I had MRIs on my brain to see what the dissociation was about, and they found nothing. And so at the end of all of that, my doctor said to me, so what's really going on? It seems like something else is going on. And I told her, and for me, again, a very unfulfilling response, because the first thing she said, she wasn't empathetic at all. The first thing she said was, are you hitting her? Wow. And, I mean, so I recognize, again, kind of in retrospect, when I look back at it, I lost all trust in her as an ally or to somebody to support and help me in that process when she asked that question. I didn't really analyze it at the time in that way. I just realized that I didn't really trust her because she felt like she was blaming me for it. So I'm sorry, and I missed, what was your next question? Oh, why did I stay?
Why did you not leave?
Yeah. It has to, I've recognized this subsequently, again, in retrospect, is that and this is actually what kept me in all, there's been 3 major romantic relationships in my adult life, and it's kept me in all 3. And it's really an element of my own codependence. There was an element of me that needed to be in a relationship, and even though it was, and I know this is very dichotomous and doesn't make any sense to people probably listening from outside of the relationship and in healthy relationships, but there was a part of me that felt like I needed to be loved. I needed to be in a relationship. And it also went to my own self-esteem, where I just didn't feel like I was a valuable enough person that I could get another relationship. So I felt like really desperate that if I left this relationship, I would be alone for the rest of my life. That's what was going through my head. And I didn't want to be alone, and I wasn't strong and healthy enough personally to feel like I could live my life alone. So that's the primary reason, is that I just felt like, and I also didn't have any money to leave after I realized that I didn't have, I had sort of thought about leaving, and then I realized I didn't have access to funds, and so that helped me to stay as well. But I can't say for absolute that I would have left if I had have had the money. I probably would have left earlier, but I still would have stayed much longer than was healthy.
I always find that the hardest question. Why didn't you leave?
Yeah.
Because I don't really know. I don't know the answer to it. And
Yeah, I
everybody's
know.
reason, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, looking at it in retrospect from a healthier place where I am now, I look at it and it doesn't make any sense. And so, to your point, I don't know that I don't even know if I know absolutely why I stayed,
Yeah.
other than I felt trapped in some way.
So what made you eventually leave? Was it the did you actually feel like your life was at risk?
Yeah, I mean, again, the physical violence up until the time of the knife incident was, I mean, it wasn't comfortable. It wasn't that great, but I could take it. It wasn't, it was never really. There was no damage that lasted more than just a few minutes. So there's a few minutes of pain or whatever, and then that was it. So I had convinced myself that I could take that, and in fact, I got to be honest. I mean, there was a part of me so I played a lot of contact sports, hockey and football when I was in my youth, and it's like a badge of honor to take those blows and not be injured by them and not be affected by them. And so again, when I look back on it, I realized that I saw myself as a warrior because I was able to take those blows and not be much impacted by it. So that's kind of where I was coming from. But then when the knife incident happened, then things began to change for me. And then so I was telling myself, you got to get out of here. You got to get out of here. But I wasn't taking any action. I was just having that conversation with myself. And then when she started screaming outside my door in the middle of the night, that's when I made the decision to leave. So it was like, okay, now I got to go. And so I shortly thereafter called a family member who I knew had been in a sister who had been in an abusive relationship herself previously, called her and told her what was happening. And she was very compassionate and empathetic. And in fact, said she would come and get me as soon as whenever I wanted to, and had an extra room in her house that I could go into in the interim until I got myself back on my feet. So, yeah.
Excellent that you got out, but what was the aftermath like? Because there must have been some psychological damage from all that abuse.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was. I'll be honest. It was huge for me. I was almost incapacitated by the time that I left. The dissociation incidents that would happen, they were often linked to exertion of some kind. So if I was, shoveling snow or even just walking, I got to the point where I couldn't walk even a block or two until I would start to feel those feelings of dissociation. and and so that stayed with me for quite some time. And even though I began, after I got out of the relationship, I began to be able to walk further and do more exertion. And I used to bike ride a lot, so I would bike ride. There was always the anxiety. There would always be a constant anxiety there that one of those panic attacks would come on again. And so now we're 4.5 years out from that relationship, and I had one of those panic attacks about 3 weeks ago, but I hadn't had one in about 6 months. So they progressively got better over time. But I also have had, I've just had to rebuild my confidence, and I wasn't able to work in my business hardly at all, and I certainly wasn't able to do any new business development because my confidence was so low. So I went back to some of those people whose contracts I hadn't renewed and went back and got those contracts again. So I've been able to, keep the lights on with that way. But my confidence was gone. One of the things I had trouble with is both my short and long-term memory, word finding. I would be in the middle of a sentence and just couldn't remember what it was I was about to say, and I couldn't find the words that I wanted to use to communicate. So yeah, and notwithstanding, there was also a lot of anxiety and depression. I mean, after I left the relationship, well, for about almost a year before I left, after I went to my doctor, she diagnosed me with depression, and that lasted for probably about maybe about 3 years, and it got progressively better, but it was there. I would be, when I first left, I was depressed 7 out of 7 days, and then after a few months, it would be 6 out of 7, and after a few months, 5 out of 7, and then it'd be 1 or 2 every 30 days or something like that. And I'm down to where I still have bouts of depression, but they're a day here or a day there, maybe 1 or 2 days a month or something like that. So the effects are still there. And ability to focus. Right after I left, well, even before I left and right after I left, I couldn't even read one paragraph in a book. And I used to read a book a week, basically. And now I got to a point where I couldn't even read one paragraph. And if I'd be working on a project at my desk, I could only work on it for about half an hour, and then I'd be exhausted, and I'd have to take a break. Whereas previously I could work for 3 or 4 hours at a time. So yeah, it had a lot of impacts on me. And I would say also my ability sort of to trust myself in evaluating other people and being vulnerable with other people. So I have really kind of shifted the way that I interact with people, and I'm very, very careful about what I disclose to people and my vulnerabilities, particularly in more intimate, close friendship situations.
And what made you decide to start the program, and how did it get started?
Yeah, so I was quite fortunate in this. So the program that I oversee and I'm a facilitator in as a peer facilitated program, and it's offered through the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. And so I was fortunate enough that I went to a social service agency, through my sister got me organized into a social service agency that was a hub for people who had experienced family violence. And I was the only client they had ever had in their whole existence who was male. They'd never had a male client before. And but to their credit, and really give them extreme credit for this, so they had no resources that they could recommend me to, because all their resources were for female clients. But they had an intern working with them, and they put the intern on the case and said, hey, find this guy some resources. And so she did. It was awesome. She found me a number of different resources that this agency didn't even know existed at the time, because they had never had a male client before. But one of the resources was the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. So I went there, and they were running this program for the very first time. And at the time, it was clinician-led. So I attended the program, and I attended their 12-week cycles. I attended a couple of cycles, and the problem was the clinicians would come and go, and they were having trouble with sustainability and continuity, because they were getting a new clinician in every time, and that would kind of change the program. And anyway, so I did, I think, 3 cycles in total. And then I had also come in contact with another agency in Toronto who was working with both males and females who had experienced childhood sexual abuse. But in both cases, the programs were focusing on recovery from trauma. So the Canadian Centre for Men and Families program was about recovering from the trauma of domestic abuse, and the other one was recovering from childhood sexual abuse trauma. And they ran peer-led programs. And so I suggested to the agency, the CCMF, that we convert the program from clinician-led to peer-led. And so I did training with that other agency. I did a couple of their facilitator training programs, and worked with the person who originally developed the program for CCMF, the domestic abuse program. And we adapted it to be peer-led. And so now, so that was about 3.5 years ago-ish. We've been running the program as a peer-led program now. We started out with 1 group per week, and it was all in person. And we've now expanded it as people are becoming more familiar with it. We've expanded it. We're now running 3 programs concurrently, and some of those are online. After COVID, we moved to online, which gave us a broader geographical reach. And we could literally now we're getting way more inquiries and people who want to register than we can um, accommodate at this point in time. And so right now I'm in the process of training new facilitators so that we can expand the program. But the program is really focused on the phases of recovery and of recovery from trauma, because people who are in abusive relationships, whether it's child who are being abused by parents, or even people who are being abused in the workplace, I know quite a number because of my work as a management consultant. Now that I understand what abuse looks like and trauma looks like, I know a lot of people in the workplace that are suffering from PTSD-like symptoms just from having been in abusive situations in their workplace, chronically abusive situations. So it's focused on that recovery aspect, and there's a model that started in the Veterans Administration in the US, primarily working at the time in the 60s and 70s with soldiers returning from Vietnam. And they identified this process, and we use that process. So it's there's 3 phases of recovery from trauma, and we help the men in our program work through those phases. It's a 12-week course. The reality is this, because of some people's situations, they're in an active trauma situation or an active abuse situation, I should say. It's harder to recover quickly, and so some people do the program 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 times as just part of their recovery path. And I think I've done it about 17 times, and I'm still recovering. I've come a long ways, but there's still things that happen. I still get triggered by things that I wouldn't have in the past. So I'm still have some shadows of the trauma and of the symptomology of trauma.
Could you explain the phases for me, please?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. Thanks for asking. It's really important. So the way the phases were developed with out of the VA, Veterans Administration, they did that with people who are, and the researchers now sort of looked at trauma in a couple of different ways, and they see that sort of trauma is what they would call like an event trauma. And then people who have been in abusive relationships are what they would call an interpersonal trauma. So another person has done something to you. And while a lot of the things are very similar, there are also some slight differences in the way that they recover. So I'm going to describe it. If you go online, you might see it described differently, and that might be more of the VA kind of model. But so I'll describe it the way I understand it, in both from the research, but also from my own observations of the men going through the group. So phase 1 is people who are just actively, in the trauma, whether it's in real life in the trauma or just in their own heads in the trauma. And even after you leave a relationship, so if I use my example, I left my relationship, I had no contact after I left. I still haven't had any contact with her. She's reached out to me, but I don't respond. And I left all my stuff there, almost everything. So I lost everything. And I just see that as gone now. I kind of conceptualize it as like I was somebody who had a fire in my house and lost everything. And that's it. It's gone. You grieve it, you mourn for it, and then you move on. But even if you leave with no contact and you don't have anything like any court cases or children or any of those kinds of things, it still takes quite a while to get out of phase 1. And phase 1 is basically people need safety and security and stability. And so that's phase 1, is just developing the feelings of safety and security and stability in your life. Because what happens often for people who have been abused is they won't even have routines. They won't eat regularly. They won't brush their teeth. They don't sleep well. They don't look after themselves. They don't exercise. They don't talk to people. They miss work. All kinds of things that are happening. And so phase 1 is just being able to get everything sort of back to some level of normal, where you're not getting emotionally dysregulated and triggered on everything that happens. We have one gentleman in our who's gone through our group who used to get triggered, or we call it activated, because triggered has some negative social connotations to it, but who would get his emotions activated and get dysregulated simply when a car squealed their tires or revved their engines when he was outside. And he doesn't know what that's linked to, but that happened to him every time. And so the recovery process, we do some meditations, and we give people some self-care strategies to work on things, and some areas of grounding and stabilization to help them move through that phase one and get to that place. And I'd also just like to say, as I describe these phases, they're not linear. So someone might still be in phase one, and even I am, like, if I get activated every once in a while by something that happens, I'm basically being pulled back into phase one. And the good news is, over time, it happens less frequently, and you spend less time there before you can move out. But so when I had that panic attack a few weeks ago, that was me just being dragged back into phase one.
Yeah.
And then phase two is I have. They call it remembrance and mourning in the official literature, but I've recategorized it. I call it see your situation clearly. And so let me tell you why I say that, is that most of the men who come into the program, if they haven't done already some significant counseling and healing, they look at their situation kind of and assign blame kind of in a polarity way. So some of the men is that it's all the other person's fault. They were evil, they were this, they were that, and they were just terrible. And other men come in and say, it was all my fault. If I only had been a better partner, if I had done this, if I had done that, if I, and so neither of those is actually true. What the other person did, yes, that was, not right. There's no excuse for it. Nobody should be able to abuse another person like that. But there was a part of us that, and we asked men this, how many of you saw red flags long before you left? And every man says yes. And so the question is, then why didn't you leave? And the answer to that is a really important one, because what it does is we know that like 60 to 70% of people who are in one abusive relationship will get into another one when we become serial targets, sort of thing. And what being able to see the situation, why did I stay, and really look clearly at that, is protective for the future, because then we can start recognizing, oh, okay, when she first threw that Post-it note in my face, I didn't set a boundary. I didn't set a hard boundary right then. Now I know going forward, I'll be able to set a hard boundary. So when men enter into phase two, or anyone recovering gets into phase two, they start recognizing kind of exactly what happened. They start seeing it for what it was, and being able to assign accountability and say, oh yeah, you know what? I could have done something different in that situation to change it, or to, stand up for myself. And so it's not all my fault, and it's not all their fault. There is definitely they're at fault, and it's not acceptable what they did. And yet there's things I can learn from my own behavior. And that's where phase two starts to develop, is when people can look at that. The other thing that happens in phase two is that we begin to separate ourselves from the abuse. So before, when we're in phase one, when we think about something that was done to us, we have an emotional reaction to it. And so the parts of our brain, the emotional parts of our brain that run our brain and shut down our neocortex and our logical rational part of our brain when the emotions and the dysregulation happens, they jump in. But what happens in phase two is we become less dysregulated by looking back at what happened to us. So we can look back at that incident. And for a long time, if I look back at that knife incident, I would get emotional again. I would feel fear, and I would feel disappointment and depression and all kinds of different things. Now I can look at that incident, and I'm disconnected from it emotionally. It has no more impact on me than my remembering going to the store for milk, That doesn't mean it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean I don't know what impact it had on me. I know all those things. It's just not, it's in the past now. It's not happening to me in the present when I think of it.
Yeah.
So that's phase two. When people get to that, they can begin to be objective about the things that happened. And they see it as a, almost like a movie in their mind. And we do exercises. In fact, we use a guided meditation that seems to be very effective for men, where we take them through a guided meditation and they take some of those events and they create them into a movie, and then we get them to play the movie forward and backward and pause it and look at it from 360 degrees. And that seems to remove the emotion from it. It disconnects the emotion from it. If they do that, if they practice that for a few times. And of course, there's hundreds or even thousands of events. So each individual event you might have to go through. But most people, once they begin to learn the process of disconnecting, their brain disconnects more generally to many of the events, not just the specific ones that they're working on. And then, so that's phase 2. And then phase 3, in the literature, it's called reintegration, and it's about getting back into normalizing our lives. One of the last things that seems to happen, and I spoke to it, like you asked me about the lasting impacts with me, is that getting back into trusting people, getting back into normal activities, things that I had lost interest in, I've now regained an interest, getting back, connecting with people, being able to socialize, being able to go out into groups of people. I mean, this is a small thing, but I used to love to dance. I have not been able to dance since, not even at home by myself, since that happened until just recently. And I made a concerted effort to start doing it with YouTube videos at home. And now because of COVID, I can't go out and do it in society just yet, but I'm looking forward to being able to do that. And it's just because I had this overwhelming fear that just completely shut me down when I thought of dancing. And part of that is because when I was with my ex and the few times we went dancing, she was very harsh in her criticism about the way that I danced. So that's part of phase 3. But the other piece in phase 3 that we see with our with the men going through the program is it's an identity piece, and there's not a whole bunch of research that I've been able to find on this, but what it seems to be is that men, and probably everybody that's been in an interpersonal chronic abusive situation, is we lose our identity. We don't know who we are anymore, because what we've done is we've adopted behaviors and masks and personas that have been designed to be protective against the abuser. Mm-hmm. And so many of the men, as it turns out, this is a whole other issue, but many of the men who come through our program were in an abusive family of origin or childhood situations. They had abusive parents, or, in some form, or maybe even abusive sports coach or something like that. They had abuse in their past. And what we end up doing is we adopt these personas and behaviors in order to protect ourselves from the abuser. But then we've done it for so long, we've normalized it, we believe it's who we are, but it's not who we are. It's a cloak or a mask that we're wearing. And so as people are working their way through phase 3, they begin to get a better understanding of who their authentic self is. And one of the things we see men, and this is it's kind of interesting and maybe a little bit humorous, at least from my perspective, that so many of the men say almost exactly the same thing. They'll be telling a story about themselves, and they'll say, and they'll see it almost as a little bit disconcerting that they are now shifting kind of their personality. Things are shifting for them, and they'll say, it's like I don't even know who I am anymore. And they say it with a note of concern because they feel like something really bad is happening to them, or potentially because it's an unknown. But for us who've been facilitating the program for a while, we know that that's really just they're on the cusp of discovering who they really are, not who they've been pretending to be for so many years. So, so that I think that identity piece is really the biggest piece. We see people when they get that, when they go, oh yeah, now I know who I am. That's when they have really gone a long ways down the path of healing, and they're pretty much back to, and I can't even say they're back to who they were before the abuse, because sometimes the abuse started so early that it's hard to even know who they really were before they adopted these protective behaviors and personas. So they become much more authentic, and they become much more calmer with themselves, and most people who have come through our program have low self-esteem or lacking confidence. And that's one of the things that contributed to them allowing others to abuse them. And now they get so much stronger and so much empowered and just really believe and know who they are and are not worried about what other people think about them and are not going to change because other people want them to. So they're really it's quite dramatic. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 cycles for men to go through that. We would like to be able to accelerate it, but that's the way it is, the way the program's working right now.
Well, I can understand that because after my abuse, I came out a totally different person, even from the person I was before the abuse.
Yeah.
So I can totally understand that, and I like that the guys you talk to and yourself is allowed to go back to phase 1, and then come back to phase 3 again. I think that's good because you are going to slip, aren't you? You are going to be triggered at some point, or get depressed or down or whatever. So it's nice that you're allowed to go back to phase 1 and then work your way up again.
Yeah, and as you say that, the message that we have in our program is that when you are triggered again and activated, it's really your subconscious telling you, sending you a message or an invitation to explore something that you haven't yet fully explored. That's all it is. So it's really, we recontextualize what those activations are. It's an opportunity to explore something, and our subconscious is just releasing that to us in ways that we can deal with it. So when I had that dissociative event a couple of weeks ago, or a few weeks ago now, I guess it is 3 or 4, it was a great opportunity because I had to look at, so what was that about? What's really going on for me? And I got to go back and discover some things about my reaction to trauma. In other words, the personas that I'd taken on and my protective responses. And I got to heal some more. So once you get to a certain place, every new activation is an opportunity to heal some more.
And what kind of men come to you? Is there a particular age group, race, religion?
No, I mean, Toronto is a very multicultural city, and we literally get men. I think about the youngest man that we've had in the program is like early 20s, 21 maybe, something like that. And all the way up to, I think the oldest was in his 70s. And literally every race, every socioeconomic strata. I mean, our programs are free, and so I would say we are weighted more towards people that have financial resource limitations, because people with the finances maybe go a different path. And our program's available to anybody who's male identified. And we get people from all of across that sexual orientation, sexual identification spectrum as well. And men come to us at different places in their own recovery. We do get a lot of people that are in phase 1. In fact, I would say most of the men, probably about 75% of the men that enter into the program are in a crisis. They're really I recognize it. That's where I was right after I left, or right before and right after I left. I was just in a complete crisis and had no kind of resources. I didn't know what to do, didn't know where to turn. So probably about 75% of the men who arrive in our program are in that place. Yeah.
And is it mostly domestic violence, or is it mostly some other kind of abuse?
Yeah, so the program is designed for people who have been in domestic abuse situations. However, and a domestic sort of is a connotation for cohabitation, so we call it actually partner abuse or relationship abuse. Because it can even be, there's a lot of abuse that happens even in dating partners that aren't really in a full-blown relationship yet, even just early on. And then we've also been just recently, within the last 6 months, been accepting men who have had childhood abuse, not sexual abuse per se, but more like familial. It's really family violence, is what it is, you know. So, so if we've been expanding the umbrella a little bit, and part of the interesting thing that we find is those men who come in who've had experienced family violence in their childhood, once they get into the program and we start taking a look at it, they begin to recognize that they had it in their adult relationships as well. They just didn't see it as that, and partly because the abuse that they experienced in childhood they had normalized. Like, that's what happens in a loving relationship, so it's no big deal. So then when it happened in adulthood, they didn't even think of it. They didn't categorize it as abusive because it was just normal stuff that happens to people in loving relationships, you know. So yeah, we've been allowing people in under the umbrella of any kind of family violence. Yeah.
And what kind of support systems are available in Canada apart from yourself? Are there any?
Yeah, not very many. Yeah, it's really there really aren't very many. I mean, more and more counselors are coming on board with offering services specific to men who have been in these situations. We have at the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, we have a limited number of counselors. I think there's about 5 counselors that work with men who come to us. Now, not all the men who come to us are the scope of the Canadian Centre for Men and Families deals with men who are in legal false accusation situations and parental alienation, which is a form of domestic abuse. Also mental health, all kinds of different situations. So the counselors will deal with any of those people that are in those crises. We also have a legal clinic for men, and it's basically giving free legal guidance, both for criminal and family law issues. But overall in Toronto, or in Canada generally, there's not much. We are working right now, we're probably about a year away from opening the first shelter, I should say, that's dedicated to men and their children fleeing domestic violence. There isn't one in Canada yet, anywhere in Canada. So men have nowhere to go. The only options for them is a homeless shelter, which they can't take their kids to, and which has, it's not really, often those shelters aren't really all that safe, quite frankly. So there are no options that way. The police haven't really adopted. I've been, following on Twitter some of the things that are happening in the UK with the police and the mayor of London coming out and saying, if you're a male and you're experiencing domestic violence, we don't have anything close to that here. The police believe that if there's domestic violence, it's only possible for the male to be the perpetrator. The male cannot be the target. It's just not possible. And by the way, I use some words here. I noticed myself using it that I wanted to speak to. Many of our men, and this may be just Canadian, I don't know, but many of our men do not identify as victims. They don't like that word because it seems like a victim equals disempowerment. And so we use the word target. So they are targets of abuse as opposed to victims of abuse. And they also aren't really keen on the word survivor either, because again, that seems like a disempowering thing. I'm a survivor, whereas they talk about having recovered as opposed to surviving, because recovery connotes thriving, where surviving connotes just barely making it through, sort of thing.
Yeah. So the language is very important in Canada then. It
is, at least with our groups. It seems to have an impact on men's, on their psychological ability to think about what their situation was. When we, target is, for me, is when we use the word target, you can just see men go, yeah, that was me. When we use the word
Yeah.
victim, they kind of go, I don't know if I was a victim exactly. And then you describe the same experience and you say target, and they go, yeah, that was me. So that's our experience.
And how do you think things can improve in Canada, or in to do with domestic violence anywhere, really?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is societally, uh, we need to, and I'm saying we being the collective we, need to accept the idea that men can be targets as well as women, and that they're, the stats from Stats Canada in their most recent general social survey, where they surveyed men and women, 35,000 people, and asked questions about it, and they asked questions that are closer to the conflict tactics scale that Murray Strauss developed about, what were the behaviors, and when they asked those behaviors, I think it was 51 or maybe 52% of the people who responded and said they were in a violent domestic violence situation within the last 5 years. 52% of the people that said yes to that were male, and 48% were female. So in Canada, when you do an anonymous survey with good questions about behavioral violence, more men report having experienced it than women. So I think until we as a society just accept that fact, that it's pretty much evenly distributed amongst the genders, we're going to struggle.
Yeah.
And then once we accept that fact, then policies and can follow, and then policies and money and services will all follow. But until we do that, we're going to be, it's an uphill battle. Just, we're fighting here with our agency, and we're making progress, but it's so slow and so incremental. But, it is there. I mean, I'll give you one example. I do a lot of speaking in front of other groups, other agencies and policy groups and so on. And 4 years ago, when I first started doing this speaking, people did not want to hear that stat about the equal gender equality of the distribution of violence. Nobody wanted to hear it. And as a matter of fact, I would get really strong objections when I would mention it, and people would say, no, it's wrong. They're dealing with the Canadian government's research here. But anyway, and telling me I was wrong. But now 4 years on, I talk about it and I almost never get an objection. People go, oh, I didn't know that, but they don't object to it. They accept it. So there's a lot of acceptance that's begun to happen. We're still a long ways away, but it is beginning to happen in Canada. And I look at the UK with envy, and I know you guys probably feel like you have a long ways to go too, but you are way ahead of us in terms of that acceptance. And so I've started following a lot of people on social media in the UK, just to try and learn from or soak up by osmosis whatever is happening over there.
Well, to be quite honest, it's more bluster than it is action.
Oh, okay.
to be fair, I think exactly what you said is right in the UK as well as Canada. Society needs to look and recognise that there are male victims as well as female victims, and domestic violence is non-gendered.
Yeah.
I mean, we have Women's Aid in the UK who, on their website, say that domestic violence is a gendered crime.
Sure, yeah.
And they are a very powerful organisation. And until organisations like that recognise it, we haven't got much of a chance.
Yeah.
But we keep fighting. Everybody's doing their bit. I'm surprised at how many men have come forward and said, I want to talk on FTD Talk, because the more we talk about it, the more it'll get out there. And it's amazing that men have come forward and said, yeah, I'll do it. And I take my hat off to their bravery.
Yes, absolutely. And stories are very powerful. People hear stories. Some people need statistics, but they somehow people dismiss those statistics. But when they hear stories that are real and raw and authentic, it's hard for them to dismiss it. It's like, no, okay, that happened. And then they can connect it to the statistics. So I use my own story a lot when I'm out in the community talking, and stories of other men. So, and I've got permission from the men in our groups to be able to tell stories, and without naming names or anything, completely
Yeah.
anonymously. But yeah, telling stories has a big impact. So yeah, and I really appreciate the fact that you're giving people the opportunity to tell their stories. It's just awesome that you're doing that.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate the opportunity to come on today and tell my story and talk about our program. And hopefully, if anyone's listening, I always say this whenever I'm doing anything that's a broadcast into the community. If anyone is thinking that they might be in an abusive situation, they're not quite sure, go find some supports and find somebody to talk to, somebody who can help you to see if you are. Because I got to tell you, most of the men who come to us had a period of time where they were denying that they were in an abusive situation or were questioning it and didn't believe it. And when the facts are laid bare in front of them, it's really clear that they were. So if you even have a suspicion, take a next step, reach out to somebody, find somebody trusted to reach out and talk to.
Well, thank you for talking to me today. It's been fascinating, and your program seems really, really well organized and really set up to help people. And I wish you all the best with that.
Great. Thank you so much. And again, I appreciate the time to be able to talk about it and all your efforts that you're doing to change the conversation.
Thank you. And like I say, I wish you all the best. And again, thanks for talking to me today, and take care.
Great. Thanks. You too. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Hello, and thank you for listening. Mike is just one of many, many brave men who've come forward and spoken about their experiences on the show. I hope that many more male victims will do the same. Until next week, take care. Peace.
Nothing I could do is ever good enough for you.